All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Stephen Terry Zinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinn Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 20th yahrzeit. Our week of learning sponsors, the Friends of Yitzi and Yankee Statman, in memory of their mother, Chaya Statman Zichron Livracha. May her neshama have an aliyah, and may the family have a nechama. And of course, we dedicate our learning to all of those who need a refuah. Zevachim Hashem to have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu Shemir Hashem continue to shower besoros tovos, brachas, yeshuas, and nechamas, and shalom upon all of Klal Yisrael. Because with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Mem Daled 44. We are picking up on Mem Gimel Abed Beis 43b. If it's okay, let's just actually pick up. I'm going to start about 13 lines up from the bottom. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. 13 lines up from the bottom. Amar Rava. So again, middle of the line. This is actually kind of just in the middle of a sentence, but again, Rava begins a full thought. So let's just begin there. Amar Rava. Kol kra de la mefarish le Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Any pasuk that Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi did not explain, v'chol masnisa de la mefarish le Rav Zeiri, or any brisa that Rav Zeiri didn't explain, lo mefarsha, ultimately again has not been explained well. So first of all, what a compliment, right? What a compliment. Rav is saying the only person who really knows how to explain a pasuk is Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, and the only person who knows how to explain a brisa is Rav Zeiri. So Hachiyam Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Avudimi. So because what did Rabbi Yisrael bar Avdimi say? Now remember again, the context over here was the pasuk of V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher laHashem v'tumaso alav. If a person will eat from kachim, v'tumaso alav. Remember, yes, we had a machlokes of v'tumaso alav. What does that refer to? Is that saying that the person is tamei, or ultimately again that the meat is tamei? So we had that machlokes. So again, in this that's why this is being brought up. So therefore, Rav Yisrael bar Avdimi says, and we read this essay. So I'm gonna run through this for just a bit. Since the pasuk opens up with lashon, a feminine lashon, ends with feminine lashon, and has zachar in the middle, masculine in the middle, it must be referring ultimately again to tumas aguf. So remember again, that's here for us because remember we saw 4 different opinions all pointing in the same direction, that the pasuk is referring to tumas aguf. The pasuk is referring ultimately again to a person who is tamei, who consumes sacrificial or kodesh meat, not to the actual sacrificial meat that is tamei. Okay, fine. So that's the example of a pasuk that Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi darshan. Masnisa was an example of a brisa that was interpreted by Rav Zeiri. Masnisa desanyo im ne'emru kalos lama ne'emru chamuros v'im ne'emru chamuros lama ne'emar kalos. Okay, so we'll see what this is referring to in just a moment, but literally translated, if the Torah goes out of its way to mention the more lenient items, then why the need to mention the more stringent items? And if it mentioned the more stringent items, why mention the lenient items? Now, what exactly is this referring to? If you take a look at Rashi is about 10 lines up from the bottom. Im ne'emru kalos le'inyan achilas kodshim betumas haguf shnuye b'taras kanim le'kalim farish v'azil ma'kalas ma'chamuros. So the context over is actually talking about a situation of a person who eats kodshim when ritually impure. So I have tumas haguf, I am tamei, and I eat kodshim. Now we don't know what kalos or chamuros are referring to. We'll have to see that in just a little bit. So first the brisa works through this. Im ne'emar kalos v'lo chamuros. If the Torah would have just said the kalos and not the chamuros, hayisi omer ala kalos b'lav ala chamuros b'misa. I would have said, and again I both said, right now we have no idea what kalos and chamuros mean. So we'll just go with it for a little bit now and fill in the blanks a little bit later. If it would have just said the kalos and not the chamuros, the more lenient ones, not the more stringent ones, hayisi omer ala kalos b'lav. On the more lenient ones, there's a lav. V'ala chamuros b'misa. And on the more chamur ones, ultimately, again, there's a death penalty. Okay? L'kach nemar chamuros. Therefore, the Torah says chamuros to teach you that even for chamuros, ultimately, again, it's quote unquote only a lav and not a chiyav misa. Again, if this doesn't make sense, it's not because you're missing something. It's because we have no idea what kalos and chamuros are referring to. And ultimately, again, if we would have just said chamuros and not kalos, hayisi omer ala chamuros yehi chayiv ala kalos yehi pater. I would have thought on the chamuros yechayiv and on the kalos yehi pater. Lekach ne'emar kalos. Therefore, it also includes kalos to say that kalos are also punishable by a lav. The Gemara says, okay, my kalos or my chamuros. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? What is kalos and chamuros? Ilema, kalos meiser, chamuros truma. Oh, okay. So now this begins to make a little bit more sense. So remember, we're talking about a person who is consuming kodesh items in a state of tumah, a state of ritual impurity. So maybe what kalos and chamuros refer to are consecrated items. So kalos refers to items of lesser sanctity. Chamuros refers to items of greater sanctity. So the Gemara says, my kalos and my chamuros, even kalos, meiser, chamuros, truma. So maybe kalos is like meiser, right? And chamuros is truma. Then again, I both say, and what is the Torah telling me? The Torah is telling me that whether you eat kalos or chamuros in a state of ritual impurity, you are subject to a lav, right? It is asr. Is that what it's saying? Hayisi omer b'misa. So the Gemara says, I would have thought then that truma, right? If you eat truma in a state of ritual impurity, ultimately again you're chayiv misa. So the Gemara says, 1 second, hashnam misa. You are chayiv misa. In other words, if you go ahead and you eat truma in a state of tuma, ultimately again you are chayiv misa. V'su lo ne'emar hayisi omer b'misa dayo lava min adin lios pinidon. Furthermore, again, I will say, for what you said before, ultimately, and then if it would have not said it, right, by, let's say, kalos, you would have said by misa. Ultimately, that couldn't be. Why? Because whenever you learn something whenever you learn out B from A, so the scope of B is always limited by the parameters of A. Ella, kalos tumas sheretz, chamuros tumas meis. Rather, kalos must refer to, so we'll say, so rather the Gemara switches gears. Kalos and chamuros doesn't refer to consecrated items. What does kalos and chamuros refer to? Different levels of tumah. Right? So now we're switching. So rather, what does kalos mean? Kalos means a relatively, we'll call it low form of tumah, which for example, tumas sheretz, person touches a dead rodent. Chamuros refers to tumas meis, ritual impurity from contact with a corpse. So the Gemara says, ubimai. Now that's fine, but what type of item are you consuming? Right? So again, now what the Gemara is telling me is that whether or not you have a high form of tumah or a lower form of tumah, ultimately there's a prohibition to go ahead and consume consecrated items. But the shaila is now, what are you consuming? What are you consuming? Ubimai. Ibit truma. If we're talking about truma, idi v'idi hu b'misa. So I'll say, so remember again, consumption of truma in a state of ritual impurity, no matter what your level of ritual impurity is functional by misa. V'su lekach ne'emru chamuros belav habamisihi. Furthermore, when the Brisa said that even chamuros are belav, but that's not true. Truma consumption in a state of tuma, no matter what your state of tuma, is punishable by misa. To which we're going to skip the parentheses. V'bachilas meiser. And if we're talking about again a person who's tamei who consumes meiser, top of Memdalet 44a. Imlo ne'emru chamuros. Hayisi omer ala chamuros b'misa. If then what the Brisa said before, had it not stated the chamuros, I would have said the chamuros are b'misa. Mitumas sheretz ka'asya. This is being learned out from tumas sheretz. V'dayo lavo min adin lios kinidon. And again, I will say, we just said before, dayo means whenever you learn out B from A, so again, the scope of B is limited by the parameters of A. So therefore, again, if we're going to be learning out from tumas sheretz, that means it's limited by the parameters of sheretz, which is subject to a lav and misa. Amar Zeiri, so Zeiri says like this. Amar Zeiri, I will say, and I remember again, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because Rava came along and said that any brisa that is not explained by Rav Zeiri, ultimately you can't understand it. So here we have quite an enigmatic brisa, and meanwhile, again, who's about to save the day? Zeiri. Zeiri, that's why this has nothing to do with our topic at hand. It's only being brought up because, again, remember, Rava said any pasuk that's not interpreted by Rav Yitzchak, by Rav Dimi, you're not going to understand. And we needed that pasuk because that pasuk taught us about the idea that it's talked, that remember again, the pasuk in Vayikra was talking about Tumas HaGuf and not Tumas HaKarban. And then he also made a corollary statement, which is any brisa not interpreted by Rav Zeiri, no one knows what it's talking about. So then the Gemara brings an example of this. That's why this is here. Amr Zeiri. So Rav Zeiri comes along and he says like this. Guys, here's what it means. Kalos, Tumas Sheretz. Chamuros, Tumas Meis. So in reality, when the Brisa talks about Kalos and Chamuros, it's talking about Tumah, at least initially. 44a, 4 lines down from the top. So Ziri says like this, Kalos means relatively lower level of Tumah, i.e. Tumas Sheretz. Fine. Chamuros is Tumas Meis. Good. This is what the Brisa means to say. This is fascinating. Ilu ne'emar Tumas Sheretz, v'ne'emar Meiser, u'truma lo ne'emra. Right? I'm sorry, u'truma. So I'll say, for example, had the Torah just taught me the halachas that if you're tamei Tumas Sheretz, and then it would have told me that if you're tamei Tumas Sheretz and you consume Meiser and Truma, v'lo ne'emra Tumas Meis, and there is no mention of Tumas Meis at all. So all the Torah would be telling me is that halacha l'maisa, if you have Tumas Sheretz and you consume Truma or Meiser, it's punishable by a lav. Hayisi Omer, kalos ala kalos belav, va'ala chamuros b'misa. I would have thought like this. If it's kal al kal, now what's an example of kal al kal? Tumas Sheretz on Meiser. Right? Tumas Sheretz consuming Meiser. That would be an example of a lower form of Tumah. Ultimately, again, for a lower form of consecrated item, I would have said ultimately, again, that's punishable by a lav. Vala chamuros b'misa. But ultimately, again, if you have kalos al chamuros, which is, for example, let's say, a lower form of tumah, ultimately again on a higher form of consecration like truma, that would have been misa. Only the kalos ala chamuros b'misa. So therefore I will say, now the lashon of it is very interesting. I will say, what is kalos al chamuros? So the first word refers to the level of tumah. The second term ultimately again refers to the consecrated item. So kalos al chamuros means lowest form of tumah, which is tumas sheretz, on higher form of kedusha, which means truma. So I would have said again, so based on this again, so therefore Ziri says, I would have thought initially that kalos al kalos, tumas sheretz on meiser, ultimately punishable by a lav. And therefore I extrapolate from that ultimately again, kalos al chamuros is b'misa, that ultimately again, tumas sheretz by truma would be chayiv misa. If that's the case, chamuros nami al kalos b'misa. I would have thought, therefore, also what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, chamuros on kalos. What's an example of chamuros al kalos? Tumas meis on meiser. Tumas meis on meiser, which is again more chamur form of tumah, on a lighter form of consecrated items, are also a misa. Lekach ne'emar chamuros. Therefore, the Torah goes out of its way, ultimately again, to go ahead and tell me chamuros also. And therefore, I will say, halacha l'maisa, teaching me that if there's tumas meis, ultimately, again, who eats meiser, only chayiv malchus. So, you know, both say, the one piece to remember in all of, like I said, this is only being brought down in a totally adjacent topic, not our primary topic at all. Just a couple of interesting facts that do come out of it. So, first of all, truma consumption in a state of tumah is always going to be chayiv misa. Right? That's a pasuk. Right? If you eat truma in a state of tumah, and again, it seems to be irrelevant of the state of tumah. So we're talking about biblical tumah, not rabbinic tumah. One will be chayiv misa. But interestingly enough, what does come out from this is that halacha l'maisa, anytime you have kalos and chamuros, or ultimate, well, I should say chamuros and kalos. So for example, even tumas meis, who consumes essentially anything but truma, will only be punishable ultimately by a lav. Fascinating idea. Okay, good. Let's go back to our regularly scheduled program. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, "Kol sheyesh lo matirin, bein la'adam bein lemizbeach chayav lo mishum pigel." So let's remember again. This is a quote from the Mishnah. So remember, back to pigel. All roads lead back to pigel. So I'll say. So remember again. So lemaisa. Remember where the Mishnah said there's a rule. When does something become pigel? Something becomes pigel if it has a matir. It has to have a permitter, right? And the chiddush of the Mishnah was that the permitter itself doesn't become pigul, which we'll get into. So anything that has a matir, whether that matir is la'adam or lemizbeach, meaning what? Whether the matir is the consumption of something by a person or ultimately the consumption by a mizbeach, ultimately then that object is subject to pigul. So here we go. Tan Rabbanon, o eno maybe, elakiyotzi b'shlamim. So maybe not nabose. Now we're gonna talk about it more in depth today. But remember, interestingly enough, the concept of pigul is learned out where, or is mentioned where, in the context of shlamim. Shlamim, that's where the concept of pigul is brought down. So the Gemara says, well, maybe not. Maybe pigul, since it's brought down by shlamim, only applies by shlamim. Right? Maybe that's the halacha. So the Gemara says, and say the following: just like shlamim is consumed for 2 days and 1 night, so the Gemara says, so to maybe pigul only applies to anything that is consumed for 2 days and 1 night. In other words, maybe that's the limit over here, as opposed to saying that if something has a permitter, ultimately it's subject to shlamim. Maybe just the halacha is duration. Just like shlamim, 2 days, 1 night, so to halacha l'maaseh, any item consumed 2 days and 1 night is subject to shlamim. The Gemara says, how do I know that even something that is consumed for 1 day and 1 night is also subject to pigul? Talmud lomar, mi basar. Kol sheshirayin echolin. So again, now what is it? So mi basar says from its flesh, which tells me that anything whose remnants are consumed, subject to pigul, that's fine. But ola shein shira and echal minayin, how do I know that an ola that has no, so to speak, residual that is consumed, right? Because an ola is fully consumed of mizbeach. How do I know that that's subject to pigul? Talmud lomar zevach. The pasuk says zevach, which really comes to include any carbon. How do I know that ultimately, again, even ofos, bird offerings, menachos, meal offerings, to the point that even again, the lug of oil for the mitzorah, again, I'll also speak that's more in depth today as well. Remember, for the mitzorah, there's an oil application, right? A blood application on him, an oil application. How do I know that the laws of pigul even apply to that lug of oil? So the Gemara says, Talmud lomar, asher heim makdishim li. Ultimately, because the pasuk says that they consecrate to me, which indicates to us any sacrificial consecrated item is going to be subject to pigul. The Gemara says, va'asi nosar, and ultimately nosar is learned out, chilul mituma, from exer shavata tuma, va'asi pigul, avon minosar. And ultimately, again, pigul is then learned out from exer shavav avon from nosar. Incredible. So the Gemara says, okay, so we'll say, what's the bottom line? Bottom line is, everything is included in pigul. That's bottom line, right? Everything is included. So the Gemara says, well, I don't understand. So I don't understand. If at the end of the day, everything is included, so then why is it that the Torah specifically lists pigul in the context of shlamim? In other words, it's clear that everything is, when I say everything doesn't mean everything, but you understand a lot of, right? Everything for our purposes, including pigul. Why mention it here by shlamim? To which the Gemara says, Lomar lecha, is very interesting. Mashlamim miyuchadim, sheish lahen matirin, bein la'adam, bein lemizbeach. Just like shlamim is unique about saying that, well, shlamim has a matir. Shlamim has a matir, right? What's the matir ultimately again by shlamim? B'pashtus, it's zrika. Right, zrika blood applications, right? Also remember again, shlamim also happens to have a consumption part. So just like shlamim has a matir, whether that's a matir, right, that is consumed by man, or a matir that is consumed by the mizbeach, af kol sheyesh lo matir bein la'adam bein lemizbeach chayav lo mishum pigul. Ultimately, therefore, anything else that has a matir, whether that's a matir because it's consumed by the mizbeach or consumed by man, is subject to pigul. So therefore, we'll say fascinating. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, it turns out that the Torah goes out of its way to discuss the concept of pigul ultimately in the context of shlamim to teach me this one yesod. Just like shlamim has a matir, so too again pigul requires a matir. That's it. Beautiful. Says the Gemara. And now we're just going to get into this a little bit more. So now, interestingly, the Gemara quotes, if I understand interesting, the Gemara is quoting a brisa now but the Brisa sounds almost exactly like our Mishnah. So for example, just some examples of matirim, of perimeters. So example, by an ola, when you sprinkle the blood, you do zuriga, that allows the meat to be offered up on the mizbeach, and the hide becomes permitted to the kohanim. Ola saof, by ola saof, which is a bird ola, dama matiris b'sor mizbeach. So again, the application of its blood. Now, also remember, I think I mentioned this yesterday, and we're going to talk about this. By bird offerings, there's no shchita, right? Because you do malika, and there's no kabbalah. There's no receiving of the blood in a utensil. Instead, really what happens is, after you do malika, the blood is pretty much just like squeezed from the bird onto the mizbeach. So again, by bird, the blood is the matir. And what is it? What is it matir? What does it permit? It permits the offering of the flesh onto the mizbeach. Chatas ha'of, a bird chatas, dama matir, b'sar l'kohanim. Now chatas ha'of, interestingly enough, is consumed by the kohanim. And again, as soon as there's a blood application, you can eat the meat. Parman esrafim, siram esrafim. By again, parman esrafim, siram. So remember, this refers to chatas pinimi, right? So parman esrafim is par helam davar min hatzibor, par koin Mashiach, par of Yom Kippur. Sirim han esrafim is the seir for communal avodah zara, and the seir for Yom Kippur. So these items which are chatas pinimi, damam matirs imorehem likarev. Their blood application ultimately again allows their sacrificial parts to be offered up. That's it. So what was the point of this? Quote from the Brisa, which we're now going to just kind of pull apart a little bit and analyze. Just examples of matirim, of perimeters. Let's go. So the Gemara says, umotzi aniesa komets, but let's say I'll exclude other things. What do I exclude? Komets, levona, kitores. This is just lists from the Mishnah, but it's a Brisa. Komets, right? We'll say, now why doesn't komets become pigel? Why doesn't komets become pigel? Because the komets itself is the matir and doesn't have another matir. Remember again, this is the great anomaly, the great cosmic mystery of pigel, which I know has been keeping you all up at night, right? Which is, interestingly enough, a carbon mincha can become pigel by offering up the komets with a chutz lizmano mindset, yet the komets itself does not become pigel. For the simple reason, because it's a technicality. Because in order to become pigel, you need a matir. The komets is the matir and doesn't have another matir, therefore can't become pigel. And that's the common denominator. Same thing with the levona, which is the matir of one of the matirim, ultimately or called mincha. Kitores, which is fully consumed ultimately, and there is no matir. Minchas kohanim, that's if a kohen offers up a mincha. That mincha is fully burned on the mizbeach. There is no komets, therefore there is no matir. Minchas kohen Mashiach, that's the minchas chavitin, which is the daily offering, twice daily of the kohen gadol, which also fully consumed the mizbeach. Was the first wide line. Minchas nisachim, which is ultimately a mincha, right? A mincha that accompanies nisachim. V'adam, and blood, right? Because blood itself is matir. So these are all examples of items that do not have a matir, and therefore halacha l'maisa cannot become pigel. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon says, Mashlam yuchadin sheish ba mizbeach chitzon v'chayav and alav. So what says is wild. Rabbi Shimon says, as we saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says that no, remember, pigel is in the context of shlamim. And why is that? Because shlamim is unique. What makes shlamim unique? Mashlam yuchadin sheish ba mizbeach chitzon v'chayav and alav. So what's unique about shlamim? Number one, shlamim is offered up on the outer mizbeach, right? On the outer mizbeach. And you're chayiv. Pigel. Pigel. Wow. Shimon says the halacha l'maisa. No, the only things that can become pigel is that which is like shlamim. In what sense? Just like ultimately shlamim is offered up on the outer altar, so too only an item offered up on the outer altar, the mizbeach hachitzon, can become shlamim. Anything not offered up on the outer altar can't become pigel. Yatsu, what does this come to exclude? Parman esrafim, sirman esrafim. And therefore I will say, fascinatingly enough, according to Rabbi Shimon, any chas pnimi, anything offered up inside of the Beis Hamikdash cannot become pigel. Technicality, fascinating. So we'll say, what's a good example? So now, it turns out that shlamim is really the paradigm. Like shlamim is the paradigm. Anything that is like shlamim can become pigel. Not like shlamim can't become pigul. Therefore, Allah said, just like shlamim is offered up on the mizbeach achitzon, outer mizbeach can become pigul, so to anything else offered up on the outer mizbeach can become pigul. Good. So the Gemara says, what else is comparable to shlamim? So the Gemara says, bachar. So bachar is a good example of this. Why? What's unique about bachar? Because like shlamim, which can be consumed for 2 days and 1 night, so too bachar can be consumed for 2 days and 1 night. So the Gemara says, b'mai. How do we learn that out? B'mai asi. How do you learn that out? So we'll say, so again, now, I understand, this is actually very interesting. I understand that shlomim is serving as a paradigm for ultimately, shlomim is serving as a paradigm for items that can become pigul. But what exegetical method are you using to extrapolate? That's right, I use exegetical and extrapolate in the same sentence. So I feel like that should be some chapter in my biography at some point, right? So again, so the question is, how exactly are you extrapolating that? Like, in other words, what's the exegetical method that you're learning it out from? The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. The Gemara says, if ultimately it's a mematzinu, the best way to kind of define it is it's like a common denominator. Common denominator. So if it's a common denominator, you can ask a shayla, ma l'shlamim shekhein tu'unin smicha u'nesachim u'tunufas chazei v'shok. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says shlamim is unique. Why? Because shlamim requires smicha, right? Nesachim, libations, and tunufas chazei v'shok, which is the waving of the chest and the thigh. In other words, shlamim has all of these sacrificial rites and procedures that bachar does not. Ella mi'im he'achel ye'achel. Rather, again, it must be he'achol ye'achel. Sorry. So rather, it must be learning it from the double lashon of he'achol ye'achel. It's like a riboy. So the Gemara says, 1 second. No, well, the truth is, we're going to see the Gemara is actually trying to darshan it as a klal u'pratu klal. Hani tre klali desmichi adodininu. The problem is, it's two klalim, it's two general words next to each other. So the Gemara says, and again, if you want to make a klal u'pratu klal, you need a prat in the middle. To which the Gemara says, Amarava kid Amarava. Whenever you see two klalos that are close to one another, hatel prat beinehem vidunam beklalu prat. Ultimately, again, you can put the prat in between them and darshan it ultimately again as a klal and prat. Okay, so we'll say. So essentially, what the Gemara is saying over here again is halacha lamaisa. Shlomim is really going to serve as the paradigm that whatever is like shlomim ultimately is going to go ahead and be subject to the halachos of pigul. Now, interestingly enough, the machlokes, fundamental machlokes, and Tanakh Rabbi Shimon is how far do you take that comparison? Rabbi Shimon obviously takes it very far, right? And he goes out and he says, literally like shlom, just like shlom goes on the outer mizbeach, so too the only item subject to pigul are items offered up on the outer mizbeach. Again, Tanakh doesn't take it that far, but seems to ultimately again to learn out from the riboy of he'achol ye'achel, that anything which is consumed like shlamim, ultimately again is going to be included ultimately in the halachos of pigul. Now the truth is, even that limud is a little bit restrictive because that makes it sound like only items that are consumed for 2 days and 1 night, like a shlamim, are subject to pigul. We know we don't really paskin that way. We paskin like with the rule of our Mishnah, which is the determinant for whether or not you are subject to pigul is, do you have a matir? If you have a matir, ultimately again you are subject to pigul. If you don't have a matir, ultimately, again, not subject to pigul. I will say, I'll just mention something interesting and take a little bit of literary license over here. That this phrase, Kol makom sha'at motzi shnei klolos hasmuchim zelazeh hatel prat beinehem. I know it struck me very much last night. Obviously, klal over here is written with a chaf, which means a general, or an inclusive term. But the truth is, using a little bit of a literary license, obviously, just messaging, klal, if you were to replace it with klal with a kuf, that sometimes in life, sometimes in life we find ourselves overwhelmed by just negative or tragic circumstances, which is a reality that we could very much relate to, especially again within our community. We find sometimes again that tragic circumstances, one after the other. And sometimes, like the tidal wave of tragedy, can make the world feel so dark and so overwhelming. And you have those moments where you feel like the sky is falling. And I think many of us felt that in the last little while. The overwhelming loss of Rabbi Howard Zichron Livracha, Shlomo Ari Ribiko Zichron Livracha, and overwhelming tragedies, tragedies of epic proportions. And sometimes you feel that like the sky is falling. Right? You have these shnei klalos hasmuchim ze lazeh. These two klalos, these two terrible circumstances, one after the other. And Chazal tell us, what do you do in those moments? Hatel prat beinehem. Sometimes the most important thing to do, like in the midst of tragedy, and especially repetitive tragedy, is to insert a prat in between, meaning look for the good. Look for the good. Because even in the darkest of circumstances, there's so much good. There's so much beauty. There's so much bracha. When we suffer tragedy, tragedy often eclipses everything else that is going on around us, and understandably so, especially overwhelming tragedy. But sometimes when you take a step back and you have a little bit of almost like the panoramic view in life, you're able to see that with all of the pain and all of the heartbreak and all of the sadness, there is still so much bracha. There's so much good. There's so much beauty. So when you have again, interpreting it with a kluf instead of the chaf, when you find repetitive tragedy, the avoda is to keep proper perspective and to always see the chesed of Hashem. And how do you do that? Hatel prat beinehem. Put the prat, put the specific good. Look for the good. Look for the beauty. Look for the bracha, even in the midst of the sea of darkness. So the Gemara goes weiter. Hamani. So remember again, amazingly enough, the Gemara says, until you go ahead and, right, so the Gemara said, we're going to include in Pigel literally everything, even the lug of oil for the Metzorah. We're going to include everything ultimately in the laws of Pigel. So the Gemara says, Hamani, whose opinion does this reflect? So Rabbi Meir, Desanyo, Lug Shemesh Shamatzorah, Chayal Mishum Pigel Divrei Meir. Meir says that even the lug of oil, which again, remember again, was used for the applications, ultimately again for the Metzorah, even that is subject to Pigel. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Ema Seifa. So however, look at the end of the Brisa. What is the end of the Brisa? Motziani Minchas Nesachim V'Adam. I will exclude ultimately again Minchas Nesachim and Dam. So remember again, those are excluded from Metzorah. So Dam is excluded, from Pigel. Dam is excluded from Pigel. Why? Because Dam itself is the matir, doesn't have another matir. Minchas Nesachim also is fully consumed on the Mizbeach and therefore no matir. So I will say Asan Rabbanon. That goes according to the Rabbanon, not Rabbi Meir. Disanyo, Niskei Behema Chayaron Mishum Pigel. So we'll say this is very interesting. So Rabbi Meir holds like this: the libations, the nesachim that accompany an animal sacrifice, Rabbi Meir says are subject to pigel. Why? Rabbi Meir posits they have a matir. What's the matir? It's the blood of the carbon. The blood of the carbon is the matir for nesachim and accompanying libations, and therefore ultimately again they are subject to pigel. Amrulo. So the Chachamim said to Rabbi Meir, what are you talking about? Valo Adam maybe a Zevachim hayom unesachim mikavaras hayamim. Here's the problem. So what's the problem? You don't have to bring your nesachim the same day as your carbon. Right? You can bring it literally again. He says literally 10 days later. I don't know. I don't remember what the halach is. I don't remember if 10 is an actual number or ultimately it's a bit hyperbolic. But halach, so the point over here is you don't have to bring it the same day. The Chum say the fact that you don't have to bring it the same day indicates to us that what? They're really not so linked. They're not so linked, and therefore again, the blood of the carbon should not be considered to be the matir of the nesach. Therefore, it should be subject to pigel. Amrulo, so he said, Amrulo said to him, Adam maybe is vechav, hayom, munasach b'kam Hashem. Amrulahem, afanilo amarti ela beban imazevach. Rabbi Meir responded, I agree. When I say that the dam acts as the matir, ultimately again, of the nesachim, what is that referring to? Ultimately, again, I'm referring to when the nesachim are brought at the same day as the carbon, the same time as the carbon. Amr Rav Yosef, Hamani, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Hida Amr Lug Shem Shamatzora Masnosav Sharulei. So ultimately, again, who is it? It's Rabbi. And Rabbi holds that ultimately the lug shemen of the mitzorah, the lug of oil, Masnos of Sharle, the applications ultimately again permit the oil. Umid masnos of Sharle, masnos of Mefaglile, and the fact that the applications ultimately again allow for the oil to be permitted, therefore again that's the matir, and therefore it could become pigel. The sign because we learned look shamash shamatzora molin bachi yizrok hadam. Right? Ultimately the look shaman of the mitzora, it is subject to me'ilah up until the point of zrika. Nizrak hadam, once the blood has been sprinkled, lo nanin v'lo molin. Ideally, you should not get mundane benefits from it, but if you did so, ultimately it is not subject to me'ilah. Rabbi says, molin at sheyitin matnosov. Rabbi says we commit me'ilah ultimately until the applications. V'shavin sha'asr ba'achila at sheyitin matan sheva umatan bahonos. And everyone agrees that you cannot, the Kohanim can't, because remember the rest of the oil goes to the Kohanim. Everyone agrees that the rest of the oil cannot be consumed until ultimately, again, the 7 applications and the applications on the thumbs. Right, thumbs. Amru kamid, that's for the Mitzorah. Amru kamid Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Gavra Rabak Rav Yosef Lema Kiyamasa. Would someone great like Rav Yosef actually make this statement? I will say Amar Beis, Hare Lug bifnei atzmo delechuli alma masnos of sharlei v'lo mefaglin alei. So the lug itself, ultimately, again, everyone agrees that it's the applications that permit it, and yet again it does not become pigel. Look at Rashi for just a moment before we go on. Haba bifnei atzmo mitzora shehevi ashama hayom. Right? V'lugo la'achar asar yamim. So if the mitzora brought his asham today, this is at the conclusion of his saras purification process. So if he brings ultimately again his asham today and his lug shemen 10 days later to the choli alma matnos of sharyele bachila, right? Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa that the applications are what permit the oil for consumption. The whole of the kiddush bekli kishenizrak tama asham lav shiraim didehu. And listen, obviously, if the lug is being brought after the carbon, that pashtus means that it's not in a klishares at the time of the zrika of the asham, and if that's the case, it's not related to the carbon. He goes on, he says, Dama Asham, Lav Shiraim Didehu. Then obviously, if the lug shaman is not even in a klishares at the time of the zrika of the asham, then halacha l'maisa, it's not considered to be quote unquote shiraim. The Gemara says, V'lo sharilei, afilu hachi lo mefaglina le'le divrei hakol, dein bo mishum pegel kediktani, af ani lo amarti, hilchach, ba'im ha'asham nami, af agav del Rabbi masnos of sharilei, lo mifugalim le'shein mifagel el adam o komets o shirav mishum de'iskish lemin chazvachim. So the Gemara suggests like this. So let's read it back in the Gemara. Hari luk haba b'fnei atzmo. If you bring the lug shemen by itself, meaning Mitzora offered up his asham, and then at some later date he offers up his lug shemen. If it's brought the choli amamat nosav sharolei v'lo mefaglin alei. It's the applications, whenever they occur, ultimately, again, that permit the oil, and don't make it pigel. The sanya, look, shemen shamatzora, chayav, and alav mishum pigel. Right? The lug of oil of the mitzora, you're chayav because of pigel. Mipnei, shadam matiro lebahonos divrei meir. Because ultimately, again, it is the blood application of the asham that allows the oil application on the thumbs of the mitzora. These words are a meir. Amru lo Rabbi Meir. Supposed to repeat of what we said. Sit there, Rabbi Meir, what are you talking about? Valo adam mevi ashama achshav v'lug mikan v'adasar yamim. But the comes back to Rabbi Meir, but I don't understand. The lug shemen can be brought without, the asham. The lug shemen can be brought long after the asham. The fact that it can be, and I will say, Rashi really framed this for us. See, if the shemen, I understand if you want to say that the shemen is in a klishares at the time that zrika is done for the asham, that ultimately, again, that the lug is connected to the asham. And therefore the dam is the matir, and therefore the shemen could become pegel. But the fact that the shemen, the oil, doesn't even have to be in a klishares at the time that the carbon is offered, doesn't that indicate that Of course, they're connected because everything is part of the same ritual process. But you can't say that the dam of the asham is the matir of the lug shemen, because the lug shemen could be sitting in its regular jar, not even klisharis at the time that the asham is offered. So how can you say that the dam of the asham is the matir for the shemen? To which the Gemara says, he says, "V'alo adam maybe asham achshav." A person can bring his asham now, v'lug mikan v'lasar yamim, and bring his lug shemen 10 days from now. To which the Gemara says, "You're right. Calm down." Amar lahem, "Af ani lo amarti ela beba'ima asham." Mary says, I agree with you. When I say that the blood of the asham is the matir for the lug shemen, when do I say that? When the shemen is brought with the asham. That's when I'm saying it. But if the shemen is not brought with the asham, yes, I agree with you. Then halacha l'maisa, it's not connected. And then ultimately, again, the dam is not the matir for the lug shemen. And then bepashtos, the shemen shouldn't really become pigel. To which the Gemara says, Ella Rabbi Yirmiyah the Olam Rabbi Meir. It's really Rabbi Meir. V'sami mikan nisachim. And ultimately, again, remove nisachim, ultimately, again, from the list. Abaye, the Olam lo tisam. Abaye says, no, don't remove it. V'tana luk haba'im ha'asham, v'hu adin l'nisachin haba'im ima zevach. So Abaye says, don't remove it, rather reinterpret it and say it should be the following. The same way that when we talk about the lug shemen of the mitzvah becoming pigel, what is that talking about? That's a case of where the lug shemen is brought with the asham, because it seems to be everyone agrees that if the lug shemen is brought with the asham, then the dam of the asham is the matir for the shemen, and therefore ultimately the shemen becomes or could become pigel. So too nisachim are the same way. Libations brought together with the carbon, literally together, ultimately the dam of the carbon will be the matter for the nisachim, and therefore the nisachim will be subject to pegel. Incredible. Then the Bryce also says, by the way, so it's almost two cases, right? So this is fascinating. Let's talk this out outside for just a moment. Sometimes nisachim, right, a nesach is a libation, sometimes nisachim can become pigel, sometimes they don't become pigel. Sometimes the lug shemen of the Metzora can become pigel, sometimes it doesn't become pigel. What's what? Very simple. When the Nesachim and the lug shemen, right, are brought with their respective karbanos, then the dam of their respective karbanos is their matir, they become pigel. When they're brought separately and independently of their respective karbanos, ultimately the dam is not the matir, and then they don't become pigel. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Vitana, lug habayim ha'asham v'hu adin l'nesachim. Right. So again, first category is the lug of shemen that comes with its asham, which does become pigel because the dam is the matir. V'hu adin l'nesachim. Same thing by nesachim. Nesachim that come with their respective karbanos. Ultimately, the dam is the matir. They become pigel. Then it also mentions nesachim habayim b'fnei atzmon. Then it creates a second category, halacha l'maisa again, of the lug shemen or the nesachim that come independently of their carbon, and halacha l'maisa do not become pigel. So fascinating, and again, a tremendous takeaway. So if somebody asks you on your way out, could the lug shemen of a metzora become pigel, or can nesachim become pigel? What's your answer? It depends. It depends, right? What does it depend on? Was it brought with the carbon or not? If it was brought with the carbon, then the dam of the carbon becomes the matir. Once it has a matir, it is subject to pigel. If it was brought independently, because remember again, another interesting fact over here is that nesachim and shemen can be brought after the carbon. After the carbon, halacha l'maisa, if that's the case, they're not really, they're connected, but not really connected to the carbon. The dam is not the matir. If there's no matir, ultimately, again, there is no pigel. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Chatas ha'of dama matir es b'sar l'kohanim. So remember the next thing in the Brisa said that by chatas ha'of, the blood application, which again, remember we said is not sprinkling, but rather again is a squeezing of the blood of the bird onto the mizbeach. That ultimately, again, permits the meat, permits the consumption to the Kohanim. So, from where do we know this? The Tani Levi, Kol Karbanam, Pazis says Kol Karbanam, the Rabos, The Rabbos, now both say this pasuk is v'zeyeh lecha mikodesh hakadoshim min ha'eish kol karbanam l'chol minchasam l'chol chatasam l'chol hashamam asher yeshivu li kodesh kadashim. This pasuk over here is talking about everything that belongs to the kohanim, right? All the different sacrificial items that belong to the kohanim. So the pasuk says kol karbanam, all of their sacrifices. L'Rabbos lug shemen shel metzora. This comes to include the lug shemen, right? After you do the applications on the metzora, the rest of the oil belongs to the kohanim. So the Gemara says, you would have thought min ha'ish, you might have kasarach, you would have said from the fire, right? What does from the fire mean? Maybe it's only stuff that was on the fire that becomes the property of the kohanim. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, v'hai lav mosa min ha'ishu, and the oil obviously is not the residual from the fire. Kamash malan halocha l'maisa, kol karbanam comes to include everything. Anything that is sacrificial in nature, ultimately, again, the kohanim get. L'chol minchasam, and again, the Gemara is just continuing. So, what does l'chol minchasam mean? The Rabbos minchas omer, that ultimately, again, the kohanim get the mincha that accompanies the carbon omer. Remember, the carbon omer is the barley offering that comes on the second day of Pesach. Minchas haknos, ultimately, again, also minchas knos is the mincha of the sota. Mincha of the sota, that goes to the kohanim as well. I would have thought, I would have thought like this. Generally, again, who gets to eat something? Those who achieve atonement through the item. Now, again, remember, again, the minchas ha'omer doesn't come to be mechaper. What does the minchas ha'omer come for? It comes to permit, right? It comes to permit the consumption of chadash, the new grain. So I might have thought minchas kenos levar avon kasya, and the mincha of the sota process is to determine her guilt or her innocence. I would have thought that these are items that the kohanim don't get to eat. Kamash malan, that they do. Kamash malan, they get to eat these items. Incredible. Let's continue. Right? Literally, again, what does it mean? Rabbos chatas ha'of. This comes to include chatas ha'of, that the kohen gets to eat the chatas ha'of. I would have thought neveli. I will say, remember again. What's unique about the fact that the kohen gets to eat chatas ha'of? What's unique about this? There's no shchita. There's malika. So I would have thought that's called an avela. An animal that dies, an animal is killed without proper shchita, that's called an avela. Ultimately, again, the kohen can't eat that. Kamash malan, yes, he can. Incredible. L'chol ashamam, l'rabos asham nazir ve'asham etzora. This comes to include the asham and the nazir, asham etzora. They're consumed by the kohanim. So I would have thought, since they come to rectify the state, they come to restore the Nazir and the Metzora to his previously held state. Maybe Kohanim don't get to eat that. Kamash malan, that they do. Asham Metzora behedjeksi. What I'm talking about, Asham Metzora is explicit. Ksibe. So Asham Metzora is explicit. Pasuk says he can eat it. Elo l'rabos Asham Nazir ka Asham Metzora. Rather, again, the Torah is coming to include Asham Nazir with Asham Metzora. Just like Asham Metzora can be consumed by the Kohen, so too Asham Nazir is consumed by the Kohen as well. Incredible. Asher Yashivu, right? What does that refer to? Zeg Gezel Hager. So what is fascinating? What's Gezel Hager? Gezel Hager, I will say, is in a situation, let's say I stole from a convert. And now what happens? Halacha l'maisa, again, there's a mitzvah, beheshev esagzela. There's a mitzvah to return a stolen object. But let's say now the ger died, and he left behind no living relatives, halachic relatives. So what happens with Gezel Hager? It goes to the kohanim. So ultimately, again, Asher Yeshiva, that means Gezel Hager goes to the kohanim. L'chahu shel chayehe. It belongs to you, to the kohen. Afilu lekadish boas ha'isha. And again, to use it for kiddushin. So what does this mean? In other words, sometimes when the Gemara wants to demonstrate that something really belongs to you, the way they demonstrate that is you could even use it for kiddushin, right? Because again, in order to affect kiddushin, the item has to be yours, halachically yours. So Gezel Hager, this case, belongs to the Kohanim to the point that he can even use it in Kaddish. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem at these two dots. It was like, great job. You did good today. Baruch Hashem. Great. Gemara Shkoyach, master a lot of sugyas to be continued in Emirat Hashem tomorrow. Bye, everyone. Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Shkoyach.